Genesis to the book of Ecclesiastes. I am constantly attracted to Ecclesiastes and the book of Proverbs, as we will see the close connection here. But our thoughts this evening is Solomon, a father's legacy to his son. In Ecclesiastes chapter 12, and we want to read verses 8 through 12 as we kind of get into our thoughts this evening. Ecclesiastes 12, verses 8 through 12. It says, "Vanity of vanities, saith the preacher, all is vanity. And moreover, because the preacher was wise, he still taught the people knowledge. Yea, he gave good heed, and sought out, and set in order many proverbs. The preacher sought to find out acceptable words, and that which was written was upright, even the words of truth. The words of the wise are as goads, and as nails fastened by the masters of assemblies, which are given from one shepherd. And further, by these, my son, be admonished. Of making many books there is no end, and much study is a weariness of the flesh." And so, as we began our thoughts this evening, one of the things that I noticed and that stood out as I was reading through the book of Ecclesiastes, and understand Solomon was perhaps one of the richest men that ever lived. I mean, he'd make Bill Gates look like a pauper. In a day in which kings lived in great splendor and in richness, he exceeded them all. And yet, more than riches, more than honor, more than power, Solomon wished to pass on to his son the benefit of his wisdom, which had taken a lifetime to gather. Now, I've often quoted, and it seems appropriate here, where it says, we learn from our mistakes, but learn from the mistakes of others, because you will never live long enough to make them all yourself. And as Solomon was recounting here all the proverbs and the sayings and the different things he had sought out and had written, and that which he had written, and we understand is by the inspiration of God, he says they were upright. They were words of truth. The things, Solomon culled through all sorts of things, but that which he wrote down, that which was written, he says is truth. And he said, by these, my son, be admonished. Learn from these things. This was his desire. And what he was saying here, he's kind of pointing out to his son that there are many books out there. I mean, you can read and study and everything, and to read all of these books, to try to gain all this wisdom yourself, he said, it's tiresome, it's wearisome on the flesh. I've already done it. I've been through it. I've researched them. I've gleaned out the best of it, and this is what I've written down. So don't necessarily go searching for your own and all this stuff. Just take what I've said and be admonished by it, because it's the truth. We see in verse 9 here, he said that he had set in order many proverbs. Proverbs chapter 1 Let's turn back here a moment and notice the comments that he says here. Proverbs 1 through 9 said, the Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, to know wisdom and instruction, to perceive the words of understanding, to receive the instruction of wisdom, justice, and judgment, and equity, to give subtlety to the simple, to the young man knowledge and discretion. A wise man will hear and will increase learning, and a man of understanding shall attain unto wise counsels. To understand a proverb and the interpretation, the words of the wise and their dark sayings. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. My son, hear the instruction of thy father, and forsake not the law of thy mother, for they shall be an ornament of grace unto thy head, and chains about thy neck. And so he introduces the prophet, said, my son, hear the instruction of thy father. In chapter 3, in verse 1, he says, my son, forget not my law, but let thine heart keep my commandments. For length of days and long life and peace shall they add unto thee. Let not mercy and truth forsake thee. Bind them about thy neck. Write them upon the table of thine heart. So shalt thou find favor and good understanding in the sight of God and man. Trust in the Lord with all thine heart, and lean not to thine own understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct thy paths. Be not wise in thine own eyes. Fear the Lord, and depart from evil. And this will come into play as we're studying what he says here in Ecclesiastes. It shall be health to thy navel, and marrow to thy bones. Honor the Lord with thy substance, and with the first fruits of all thine increase. So shall thy barns be filled with plenty, and thy presses shall burst out with new wine. My son, despise not thou the chastening of the Lord, neither be weary of his correction. For whom the Lord loveth, he correcteth, even as a father the son in whom he delighteth. Happy is the man that findeth wisdom, and the man that getteth understanding. For the merchandise of it is better than the merchandise of silver, and the gain thereof than fine gold. She is more precious than rubies, and all the things thou canst desire are not to be compared unto her. Length of days is in her right hand, and in her left hand riches and honor. Her ways are ways of pleasantness, and all her paths are peace. She is a tree of life to them that lay hold upon her, and happy is every one that retaineth her. And so, we see these proverbs that were written, and the book of Ecclesiastes, which was written to admonish his son. And first of all, we want to notice that as Solomon the preacher, here he calls himself. You know, sometimes the term and the idea of the preacher is someone that's always correcting you, putting out your faults or whatever, you know. The idea that sometimes we associate. And Solomon was a king, but he was a father. And I'm sure he was constantly correcting his son. Constantly. And so he portrays himself here in the book of Ecclesiastes as the preacher. He's preaching. And as he comes to the close of his sermon, he's preaching on life. What life consists of. And Solomon had lived a life that most of us would be envious of. We would aspire to be in Solomon's position. But before we do that, let us pay attention to what he said. vanity, vanity. All is vanity, saith the preacher. In chapter 11, and we want to begin here, chapters 11 and 12, Solomon is kind of bringing together everything that he has gone through and recounted about his life and his observation, his experiences on life, and summing it up to his son. In chapter 11, verse 1, he says, "Cast thy bread upon the waters, for thou shalt find it after many days. Give a portion to 7, and also to 8, for thou knowest not what evil shall be upon the earth." Now, what he's saying here, cast thy bread upon the waters. He's talking about doing good to others. That's what he's talking about. Give a portion to 7, 8 to 8. Well, when you've done what you think you can do a little bit more. But he's admonishing him here to do good while you can. When it is in your power to do so, do good. Help those that are in need. Because you do not know what the future holds. In chapter 11, he says, I think 3 times, he makes this statement, thou knowest not. Verse 2, for thou knowest not what evil shall be upon the earth. Verse 5 and verse 6, thou knowest not the works of God who maketh all. For thou knowest not whether shall prosper either this or that. He says, you don't know. And so, one of the things he's saying here, he's admonishing his son, when it is possible, when it's in your power to do so, do good, do right, especially when it involves helping others, doing good to others. That's the casting your bread upon the waters, because he says, then it comes back to you when the days turn evil. And when you're in need, those things come back. And so, we studied not long ago talking about that that which we judge, how we judge others, that which is meted out is how what will be meted out to us as we do good to others. The golden rule. It comes back to us. God in His sovereignty works through things to bring back to us those blessings when we're obedient to Him, because this is what He has commanded us to do, to love one another, to do good to one another, to even do good to our enemies and those who despitefully use us. These are the things He has commanded us to do. And so when it is in our power to do so, He's reminding His Son, don't forget to help the poor. Don't forget to give to those who are in need. Don't forget to help other people, because you don't know what the future holds and how things may turn around. And it's going to come back. And the thing, as God has said, if, be not deceived, God is not mocked. Whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. If we sow to the flesh, of the flesh will reap corruption. If we sow to the Spirit we reap eternal life. And so if when we are blessed and we have an abundance, if we consume it upon ourselves and we forget to help others, the time will come when those things will not be there. And we will not have those blessings. But neither will we have those who will come alongside to help us, because we did not extend help to others when we had the power to do so. I believe that this is what he's summing up here. In James 1:27, James, don't you like it when we just kind of sum everything up in just a verse or two? James chapter 1 verse 27. Pure religion and undefiled before God and the Father is this: to visit the fatherless and widows in their affliction, and to keep himself unspotted from the world. And so James said, pure religion is this: for God, help those that are in need. Don't forget those that are in need. He said the fatherless, the widows, those who are unable to support themselves. He said help, and to keep yourself unspotted from the world. Basically those two things. And that's pretty much, I believe, what Solomon is saying here to his son and admonishing him, that we would have compassion and show mercy and help the weak and the poor, etc. Then he acknowledges something here. He begins in verse 9, and he's talking to a young man. And this is good. There, it's nice for a change to have some young people to speak to, an opportunity to share some things with you now. And so he says in verse 9, rejoice, O young man, in thy youth. Youth must seek its own path. Rejoice, O young man, in thy youth, and let thy heart cheer thee in the days of thy youth, and walk in the ways of thine heart, and in the sight of thine eyes. Now, he's not necessarily telling this is the right thing to do, but I think he's saying, okay, I know this is what you're going to do. He says, but remember. He says, you do this, but remember. Know thou that for all these things God will bring thee into judgment. There's a time when our children think that we as their parents know everything. Then comes the time when they think they know everything and their parents are stupid. And I think that this is what Solomon is seeing here. But eventually the time comes when they realize their parents knew more than they wanted to admit. And ultimately that God knows everything. And this is really what their parents was trying to teach them all along. Proverbs, now remember he talked about the Proverbs here. Proverbs 14:12. He says, there is a way which seemeth right unto man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. Now, remember he said, let thine heart cheer thee in the days of thy youth, and walk in the ways of thine heart, and in the sight of thine eyes. He said, well, there is a way which seemeth right unto man. Proverbs 16:25. There is a way that seemeth right unto man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. Proverbs 18:17. He that is first in his own cause seemeth just, but his neighbor cometh and searcheth him. In other words, he, in his own sight, he thinks he's just, but another may see things differently. And so, there is a way which seemeth right, but he's warning him. He said, God's going to bring you into judgment for these things, and many times the end thereof are the ways of death and destruction. Youth must seek its own path. But Solomon saw something that he wanted his son to realize. You know, the son grows up and thinks, well, that's my daddy's way. I'm going to do things differently. I'm going to do things my way. But in the end, there's nothing new under the sun. What was one of the things? Solomon, in Ecclesiastes chapter 1, he begins, first of all, he points this out. Ecclesiastes 1 and verses 1 through 9 said, the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, saith the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What profit hath a man of all his labor which he taketh under the sun? One generation passeth away, and another generation cometh, but the earth abideth forever. And so Solomon is seeing his time is ending. His son's time is coming into its own. One generation passeth away, another generation cometh. But all things continue. He said, the sun also riseth, and the sun goeth down, and hastens to its place where he arose. The wind goeth toward the south, and turneth about unto the north. It whirleth about continually, and the wind returneth again according to its circuits. In other words, it repeats itself. You know, the sun rises, and it sets. Then it goes back around to where it rose, and it rises again, and it sets. From our perspective, all the rivers run into the sea, yea, the sea is not full. Unto the place from whence the rivers come, thither they return again. All things are full of labor. Man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. Notice verse 9. The thing that hath been is that which shall be, and that which is done is that which shall be done, and there is no new thing under the sun. In other words, what are you going to do? You're not going to do anything new. Whatever course you set for yourself, whatever you try, has already been tried before. See, each generation comes up, and they don't think about that. They don't think that, well, the previous generation, they've already done all this before. Solomon makes mention in chapter 2, verse 12. He says, and I turned myself to behold wisdom and madness and folly. For what can the man do that cometh after the king? Even that which hath already done. Now, Solomon is saying, and he's looking at this, he's looking at his son, he's looking at those that will come after him, and said, I've tried everything. I've done everything. I've sought out all these things. I have observed people and how they behave, and I've tried all these things. And the man that comes after me, what's he going to do? He's not going to do anything that I haven't already done. What's left for him to do? What can the man do that cometh after the king? Even that which hath been already done. Youth must seek its own path, but in the end, it's nothing new. There's nothing new under the sun. And so Solomon admonishes him to consider. Consider his ways. Now, chapter 12, verse 1 says, remember now thy Creator in the days of thy youth. You know, he says, rejoice, O young man, in thy youth, but he says also, remember your Creator in the days of your youth. And he goes on to describe how when we get old and eventually die, and that we will go to the grave. And so we are to consider what is to come. Chapter 7, verse 14. It said, in the day of prosperity be joyful, but in the day of adversity consider. God also has set the one over against the other, to the end that man should find nothing after him. That is, you know, we may prosper now, but the days will come when we will not prosper. You know, we're young now, we have our youth now, but the days will come when the youth is gone. And Solomon said, God has arranged it so. He set one against the other. That in the end, basically, he says, we leave nothing behind. The dark days, the evil days, the days of adversity consume the things of the days of prosperity. We're to consider what is to come. Chapter 11, verse 9. He said, rejoice, O young man, in thy youth, he says in the latter part. But know thou that for all these things God will bring thee into judgment. He says, therefore remove sorrow from thy heart and put away evil from thy flesh, for childhood and youth are vanity. You know, it's all vanity. Childhood and youth, it's vanity. Old age, that's vanity, you know. All the labors that you do, all the things that you accomplish, it's all vanity. Because ultimately, so whether you're good or evil, whatever you accomplish, ultimately we all come to the same end, and that is death. And after that, we stand before God and give an account to Him for the things that are done in the flesh. So remember now thy Creator in the days of thy youth, while the evil days come not, nor the years draw nigh, when thou shalt say, I have no pleasure in them. Yeah, he's admonishing us. Verse 5, chapter 12, verse 5. Also, when they shall be afraid of that which is high, and fear shall be in the way. The latter part of that verse, he says, because man goeth to his long home, and the mourners go about the streets. In other words, he's put in the grave. That's his long home. And the mourners go in the street. Verse 7. Then shall the dust return to the earth as it was, and the spirit shall return unto God who gave it. Vanity of vanity, saith the preacher, all is vanity. So, he is admonishing us here that we need to be aware and have a view of life, that life is more than just the here and now. Life is more than just what I have in my hands at this time. And so he's reminding him and admonishing him to be aware. We may be young, you may be young and youthful, and some of us are not so young and youthful anymore, but we still have, health and strength. We have the things that we have, but we should always be mindful of our relationship to God and what God's will for our life is. Because we have to give an account. in Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11, the chapter on faith and the roll call of faith. And Moses, chapter 20, or verse 24. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 24 through 26 said, by faith Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. In other words, he wasn't just looking at the present, the here and now. When he came of age and he could have become an heir of the throne of Egypt, but he considered all things, and he considered the consequences, and he had respect unto the recompense of reward. He thought about, what are the consequences of my choices and my actions? And he chose, he says, to suffer affliction with the children of God rather than to enjoy sin for a season, because attached to that affliction, attached to the reproaches of Christ, he said, was a greater reward, it was greater riches than that which he could have had as the son of Pharaoh. He had respect unto the recompense of reward. Dark days and death come to all men. And after that, the judgment, as we read there in chapter 11, verse 9. But know thou that for all these things God will bring thee into judgment. Hebrews 9:27, he says, it's appointed unto men once to die, but after this, the judgment. Solomon's concluding remarks to his son, as he pulls all this together, rings out through the ages and stands a remarkable declaration of truth and wisdom that we all would do well to take heed to. Verse 13, let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. And what's the whole matter? Life. From birth to death and all that it contains. The whole matter. All that you can do, all that you can obtain, all that you can experience, all that you might accomplish. The conclusion of the whole matter: fear God and keep His commandments. For this is the whole duty of man. Now, Solomon has seen a lot of things in his lifetime. And he saw some things that to him didn't always seem fair. He said, I've seen the righteous perish in their righteousness and the wicked prolong their days. So that doesn't seem right. But all these things are ordered of God. He said there's one end that comes to all men, rich or poor, bond or free, righteous or wicked. We all die. And so he says this is the whole duty of man. The whole purpose of man is to fear God and keep His commandments. For God shall bring every work into judgment with every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it be evil. And he stops right there. That's it. That's the conclusion. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, Paul admonishes us as believers and he's talking about death. The Apostle Paul does, but death for the believer. And Solomon, that's what he's talking about here, that ultimately we die, and God, we're going to have to come and appear before God, and God's going to hold us accountable for the things that we've done, whether it be good or whether it be evil. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 1 said, "For we know that if our earthly house of this tabernacle were dissolved, we have a building of God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For in this we groan, earnestly desiring to be clothed upon with our house which is from heaven. If so be that being clothed we shall not be found naked. For we that are in this tabernacle do groan, being burdened, not for that we would be unclothed, but clothed upon, that mortality might be swallowed up of life." He said, in this body we groan, and we don't groan or desire just to be shed of this body. As when he's talking about being naked, a disembodied spirit. He says, that's not what I'm looking forward to. Yes, I desire to lay down this body, but so I can put on that new body that God has prepared for me. He said, clothed upon, that mortality might be swallowed up of life. Now he that hath wrought us for the self-same thing is God, who also hath given unto us the earnest of the Spirit. So he's talking to us that are saved, that God has saved us and created us a new man for this very reason, that we might be complete, that we might be whole, not just a new man spiritually, but we have a new body to go with that new man. And that the time will come when this flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. And we're going to have to lay this body down. But we lay this body down so that eventually we may take up another that God has prepared for us. And he says in verse 6, "Therefore we are always confident, knowing that whilst we are at home in the body, we are absent from the Lord. For we walk by faith, not by sight." And I think that goes back to some of the things that Solomon is trying to say to his son. Don't just walk by sight. Don't just live for the moment. Don't just live with the things that you have right now. But walk by faith, trusting in God. Lean not to your own understanding. Don't just do that which is right in your own eyes, but acknowledge God. Fear God and keep His commandments. You see, let Him direct your paths. Commit your way into His hands, in His keeping. We walk by faith, not by sight. We are confident, I say, and willing rather to be absent from the body and to be present with the Lord. To know that at death we are absent, separated from this body. We lay this body down, but we are present with the Lord. Wherefore we labor, that whether present or absent, we may be accepted of Him. All the same here, if we're still here in this life and it's still in this body, we labor that we might be acceptable to Him. Fear God and keep His commandments. He says in verse 10, "For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that everyone may receive the things done in his body." That's what Solomon was saying. We need that long view. We need that perspective of life that looks beyond the present, that looks beyond this life to that which is to come. Do you know the Lord? Do you have that confidence that at death that you would be present with Him? Do you have that earnest, that down payment of the Holy Spirit dwelling in you? That you know that you're God's, that you cry, "Abba, Father." Do you have that confidence that He has a body prepared for you, eternal in the heavens, like unto His glorious body? are we looking forward to that and to the rewards that we will receive in that judgment? When we come before Him to be our deeds, our works, judged with a view to our reward. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that everyone may receive the things done in his body, according to that he hath done, whether it be good or bad. Solomon's conclusion. Maybe that would be a good title for this. Solomon's conclusion. Fear God and keep His commandments. For this is the whole duty of man. And in that statement is all the wisdom and truth that Solomon had gathered through a lifetime. That we would not have to endure all that vanity before we come to that understanding. He desired to pass that on and instill that in His Son without His Son having to, because He says with wisdom and with these things there's sorrow, there's trouble. And to spare His Son those problems and issues, He said this is the sum of it. All the wisdom, all the ages. All the books that have ever been written, distilled down into one simple statement: fear God and keep His commandments. This is the whole duty of man. Let us stand together.